our last panel. I think it's a fitting segue into us talking about DMPs. So I'd like to start just by introducing our panelists. First of all, to my left, we have Mike Chang, a system architect from Crux. Moving down the line, we have Clayton McLaughlin, the VP of Performance Media and a Group Director at Havas Media. And finally, Morgan Vaughter, our Head of Data Management at Accenture Digital. So I guess before we even get into the DMP challenge and I think we're speaking of the challenge of, it's a lot, there's a lot of challenges going on. It's making our clients get on board with it, brands just kind of convincing C-level that this is the investment that's needed. But I think the first question we should all be asking ourselves is, what verticals and brands stand to gain most from this implementation, and when is it time for a DMP? And Mike, I'd love to hear your take first, since you're on the DMP side,
sure.
Before moving down the line.
Yeah, so I'm a little biased, but I think no matter what stage you're at, you can probably find value in a DMP. So if you haven't got your heads wrapped around the data-driven marketing, getting your data together, I think there's value just in breaking down data silos, getting data into one place, all your off-site data, your email data, your on-site data, all that data in one place, and then from there, once you have the organizational readiness, making use of it. So there's value in that stage. If you've gotten that stage done, obviously there are quick wins, no regret things that you can do to get value out of the DMP from day one. So we're seeing a lot of that. I think industries that are obvious industries like finance, travel, CPGs are making use of it. They're probably maybe further along. Maybe they've done some things to get themselves there, but we're seeing other industries now kind of start putting things together, get the organization ready, get the people ready to really drive value out of their data.
I think you said it well. Everybody can probably benefit from a DMP. I don't think there's any particular brand that wouldn't. I think there's, like you said too, there's certainly industries and brands that are probably further along or more prepared or would have larger data sets and could probably do a little bit more with some of that work. So I think you could probably even argue that companies that maybe have less data probably would benefit from a DMP more, because then they could segment that, they could use that as sort of a data warehouse. So yeah, I would recommend everybody, every brand, at least evaluate whether or not a DMP would fit into their process or their tech stack, because it's going to give value to anybody. It's just a matter of what kind of budgets do you have for those things, because unfortunately these guys aren't cheap, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's analogous to the conversation we were having 10 or 15 years ago about whether I needed an integrated consumer data warehouse. I think we all kind of knew the answer back then, that the answer was yes. And in the same way, it's the answer now. We do need a way to manage digital identities across the web. As the other panelists mentioned, I think it's typically the ones that are investing in it first are the ones that have a lot of data and analytics capabilities already. So financial services is a great one because they have strong analytics and strong data from all of the credit card transaction data. And then on the other hand, it's also the players that have a lot of advertising spend and a lot of it that's being spent digitally, because if you're spending across digital channels, especially multiple DSPs or programmatically, you need a DMP, to really manage that view across touch points.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great way of summing it up. The people who have a lot of data, and then starting with the CPGs who don't have much, but they have a lot of spend. And it's kind of protecting that investment. So it was a nice little cap on that before we move on to hypothetical here. Now that we're speaking about the DMP challenge, and I'm your client, and I want you each to convince me kind of to take on this cost. It's more than just the cost itself, as Clayton mentioned. These aren't cheap, but it's also kind of wrangling a lot of support internally to get this done, and then also dealing with deployment with across a number of tech partners. So how do you sell me a DMP solution and we just kind of talked about, of course, it works. It's you got to do it. That's kind of the theoretical. But how do you sell me from a hard ROI standpoint? And I'd like to, kind of hear from each of you, but Clayton, since you've kind of been through this experience relatively recently, I'd love to hear how you did it.
For us, it goes back to the ROI discussion, right? So you have to create some of that marketing math and say, here's what you're going to save from a resource standpoint. Here's what you're going to save from an advertising standpoint. The last panel already talked about all those inflated CPMs and the lack of transparency. So there's the couple of things like those cost savings, those resource savings that you can initially provide to a brand and say, here's, we're going to save you X amount of money, right? It's kind of obvious here why you would want to do this. If it's going to cost you, $100,000 a month or whatever for a DMP, it's going to save you $200,000 in advertising and another $100,000 in resource. There you have it, right? But I think the last part of that is the stuff that you probably can't necessarily quantify. Things like transparency, complete control over your own advertising, your ability to create your own audiences, to use your own data, to use all of the things. Same way it's sold in a million times over, right? But there's not necessarily an ROI to that, and I think that's the conversation where hopefully that client, from an agency perspective, hopefully that client has that trust in you now to say, okay, you're not just bullshitting to me, you're not giving me this, just to make a little bit more money, right? This is actually really good for our business. So I can give you ROI numbers, but then at the same time, you have to be able to trust me and say, look, this is going to give you all of X amount of things that we all put into PowerPoints. But those are the pieces that really make the DMP useful and the stuff that's going to drive your business.
And you spoke specifically about resources at the very beginning. I mean, with the DMP, so of course there's resource savings, but are there added resources that you needed to educate them about?
Yes. So, and I think we'll probably touch on a little bit more who is the person that's going to, who's managing this, who's owning it. Yes, there's definitely additional resources. We're going to have to go into that. And frankly, these are pretty difficult people to find, right? It's still fairly early in this world as from a programmatic and DMP standpoint, so you're not going to find that person that has 15 years of programmatic experience or, knows the ins and outs of a DMP. So I think what we tend to find works really well from a resource standpoint is how do we get somebody that's probably has an analytics background, but then also knows media really well, but be prepared to pull in your analytics groups because those guys are going to be driving a good majority of what's going to sit in that DMP. So.
Yeah, sorry. The cross-functional nature of the kind of the team that has to work on a DMP is key. So you're going to have marketing tech, you're going to have media, you're going to have analytics, maybe your IT and data warehouse as well. So building that, what we call data center of excellence, kind of cutting across these different orgs to really focus on the DMP. You might not need an actual owner of the DMP to start. You will in time, but definitely having the layer of folks across those different functions from day one is critical.
Okay, so moving into just now, let's say I'm convinced, I'm ready to go. You guys are now, we're going to enter an RFP process where we're going to be evaluating a number of DMPs, maybe Crooks, and some others. And I want to know what's the first question we should be asking. And Morgan, this might be stealing a little bit of your thunder because you're roundtable, or this should be a preview for your roundtable later, maybe. So maybe we can start with you. What's the first things you think a brand or an agency should be looking at for the DMP?
Well, in today's fragmented Lumascape and landscape of technologies that all have DMP-like functionalities, one of the first questions I would ask is, are you actually a DMP? And then as a follow-up question, within that, what features do you cover under, segmentation, data collection, data integration, governance and activation? So really, how can you meet my needs across those? And then really focusing on what your use cases are, because if you want a DMP for personalization, that might look very different than the DMP that you want for media activation. So making sure that they still check all the boxes while also really highlighting the use cases that are important to you.
And Clayton, since you've done this recently, you probably had your own questions. Your client might have had their own questions. Did they differ, or did you feel pretty aligned?
Yeah, no, they were completely different. From an agency standpoint, one of the things that we always stress when we talk with any new partner or go through an RFP process is the support structure that we're going to get. So I alluded to it a little bit. You're not going to find these people that have been doing this for 15 years. So you, as the DMP of choice, right? How are you going to educate us? How are you going to continue to support us to make sure that, we're gonna be pretty self-serve when it comes to this, but you guys are gonna have to keep us updated on changes, on what's in the roadmap. Are we doing things correctly? Where are we missing out on opportunities? Those sort of things, right? That we ask that of any partners, and so I think that was probably on top of our list from the agency side, whereas the client was more, let's check off all the boxes. Do they integrate with this, and this? Obviously, there's the tech stack that exists. So how do you fit within that? Can you take this? Can you take that? We've got our own data warehouse. How does that play? So they had a lot more of the, I think, technical questions, and they're the ones that ended up owning the DMP regardless, and we basically just manage it for them. So that was the direction that they took. It was much more of a technical application standpoint, and we were the ones that were sort of okay, how do we make sure that we continue to get the support that we need and that we're able to drive this moving forward, assuming that we can check off all the boxes for the tech.
All right, and then going back to something, Morgan, you just mentioned about the LumaScape and making sure your DMP actually is a DMP and asking questions around their core competencies and the other kind of features they say they can do. We talked about this a little bit when we caught up a week ago, but about kind of one-stop shops now and how I can do everything for you. I've got an attribution modeler, it's great. I can do lookalikes, I can onboard your offline data. How do we, and this even came up in the previous panel, but how do we navigate that, and how have you navigated that?
Well, I think one of the first questions is just asking yourself whether you want an all-in-one solution, so whether you are kind of going to be a marketing cloud esque shop, and there's plenty of reasons to do that, and there's plenty of reasons not to. If you're not, are you going to pick best-of-breed technologies in each field? And then for the specific technologies that you were mentioning around attribution modeling, lookalike modeling, those are all things that DMPs do, but they might not necessarily be products, they might just be features. So digging in a little bit more and being skeptical of the feature itself and the roadmap for that feature is really important in terms of understanding whether it's going to meet your needs.
Mike, do you have a response for that?
Yeah, I mean, find out whether it's some of those things are being outsourced or white labeled or things like that, or built in house. Obviously, there's pretty big difference there if your DMP outsources or partners with a vendor for cross-device identity management or lookalike modeling or whatever it might be. That's fine, but just know about it. Go in eyes wide open, because obviously there might be pros and cons to that. So just find out when a DMP says they can do a lot of different things. Just see whether they're leveraging other partners, and that's fine. But just know where your data is going and know where it's going to be.
And just to add, I think from our perspective, if we see a vendor come to us and say, I can do this, and this, right? And you're talking about, especially things like attribution, or they're talking cross-channel, cross-device, and you as a DMP are telling me that you have the end-all be-all solution on that, I'm immediately skeptical, right? Nobody's doing attribution right. Nobody, right? Google, Facebook, all of those sit in their own walled gardens. They're useless, really, as an advertiser. It's great to work within, Google and Facebook, et cetera, but as a DMP, you really think you have that solution for me? Like, I'm skeptical immediately on that. I don't know, maybe that's just me, or I don't know if it's an agency thing as a whole, but like, what's wrong with just being really good at what your core business is, right? I understand that it's sexy to get into all these other conversations, and there's probably brands that want to use one company for all of that, right? I mean, I think Rob alluded to it on the last panel too, of there's 3 different, I want you to do this, this, and this, right? I don't have any problem with it. I think that's an interesting way to do it, right? Let's build our own stack based on best in breed sort of stuff, as opposed to plugging in something that, it's okay, right? I mean,
I agree with that. I think you as a marketer have to be responsible for putting technologies in their swim lanes, because the technologies themselves aren't going to do it. As we've seen, I mean, DSPs are taking on DMP-like functionality, tag management system, same thing, and vice versa. So you really have to be savvy as a marketer to know which kind of product this product is meant to fill, what need it's really addressing, and picking the right product for each of those kind of needs that you have.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, because from just my own personal experience, I do think there's some value in, especially DSPs with DMP Lite functionality, to kind of show what you could get, and kind of just get the conversation started. I've found at least that's at least part of asking the question of the DMP challenge, is saying, hey, look at all this, what we're doing within the DSP. It's obviously very limited. There's a lot of things we can't do that we want to do. The next step in that conversation is moving down this path towards the DMP. So hopefully there's some feature overlap we can actually use to kind of move things forward and get to those best in breed solutions before making the huge investment. All right, so now that we're through the RFP process, at least I think we've asked one question, or 1 or 2 questions from each other. And let's say we've decided on a DMP, and for the sake of this panel, Mike, we've chosen Crux, so congratulations, Great. You've won. So talk to us about what onboarding looks like. Who are you talking to like more commonly, who are you talking to? Is it usually the agency folks? Is it, business intelligence folks from the client side? Just talk through that, and then who you continue to work closely with kind of after the initial onboarding.
Yeah, so it really depends. I think out of the almost 200 implementations we've done, there have been 200 different implementations. Sure. Every client's a little different, but I think in a lot of cases, I think multinational and national advertisers mostly own their own stack and own their own data. So we work pretty directly with them with agency involvement. I think for the regional advertisers, we see more agency-led opportunities. So in that case, it depends on the advertiser, obviously. But I think implementation looks different, but I think we have a methodology, and all DMPs do, of getting you to some quick wins. It's all about building momentum. It's enterprise software, so if you expect media-like activation within days, that's probably not going to happen. It's enterprise software, so while that may be the case, we're not talking 6 months or anything. We want to get you some quick wins along the way, show some momentum, and really gain confidence of not only your team and your executives as well. So there's different things we can do to get you that. So the quick wins, the no regrets that I kind of alluded to earlier. I know we're talking, 2016, we're still talking about frequency capping, but frequency capping across products, across partners, across devices, things like that are easy, quick wins that a DMP can bring. So once you establish those wins and show some ROI, you can do more advanced use cases and, some on time down the road, work on sequencing and personalization on and off site and more advanced things. But it's all about building that momentum.
And then, and then between Clayton and Morgan, I have some questions for you guys about this kind of initial taking on period. Morgan, in particular, you've mentioned to me that there's some kind of heads butting sometimes when it comes to internal stakeholders, and maybe you're not able to do everything you want to do because certain data is not made available to you. How are you negotiating, or I guess navigating the internal kind of headbutting and who owns what between you and, let's say, some internal data stakeholders?
Sure. So I think one of the biggest things that people are surprised about when they get a DMP is that it's not just a technology decision, it's an operating model change that has to happen. So if you don't have a good handle on who's going to own what and how people are going to share data, it's going to be problematic once you get a DMP. So having a strong data governance plan in place is important, from everything from managing security to quality to consistency. All those things are going to be, again, really important, just like they are with any other data source, from CRM to web analytics. So making sure that you have rigor around data stewards and who's going to own each data source, who's going to own activation points, who gets to play in the DMP, who doesn't, whether your agency is going to be involved or not. Those are all really important things to work out before you even plug in the DMP.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it just seems like there's so many management pieces that you need to kind of negotiate while you're doing the RFP process, because it's going to save you so much trouble later on. And with all those kind of problems that you're negotiating, so Clayton, now that you've negotiated this, how is management on your end? And you mentioned when we spoke about different data stakeholders on the client side, 3 different ones, like a call center, the call center, the digital side, and then on your side, you've got a data team. How do you bring all this together and get the right insights?
The hardest for us was figuring out where all of that stuff actually coming out of the woodwork, visions that we didn't know existed, literally. So it was a matter of, I think, first organizing all that, and then, like Morgan said, it was building a plan around who's going to own what, and be very forthcoming about that, right? Everybody thinks they can get in and play around with it, and everybody should have access to it, and we basically said no, right? It was basically, on our end, it was, if we're going to manage it, which is the way that we originally set this up, then not everybody's going to get access to it. You can't play around in the playground, right? We're happy to take your data, and we're happy to use your intelligence and the work that you've already done to better what we're doing, but we had very specific about who's allowed to touch what and what data we're pulling in. And then it was, okay, now that's organized. We literally sat in a room for 3 days, about 16 people from all these different divisions, and said, okay, what do you have? Like, what's the data that you've built? How have you modeled with that? Is it accessible for us? Because then there's that, right? I mean, they're all buying Epsilon data or Equifax or BlueKai, whatever it is, to do all these models. Can we use that now so that we can reach the scale that we need to, whatever it might be? And then it was, okay, let's build a roadmap, and here's the plan. So it was, it felt like a software development sort of plan, right? Like, it was very specific about key dates and times and who's responsible for each of those. So it was a lot first of just a discovery phase of, after we even went through this whole thing, of bringing all that together and sitting in a room and hashing it out. It was kind of like an intervention session, right? We sat in a circle and kumbaya'd at the end of it. But it was, yeah, that's what we did. We laid specific ground rules on the whole thing, and so far it's worked. I think, again, we're still in the early phases, so we'll see how quickly we can screw it up.
So correct if I'm wrong, it sounds like you guys did that after the fact, kind of after you made a choice?
Yeah, I mean, we did it originally, right, as part of the entire RFP process, was to try and to discover what exists as far as, like, data sources and internally what are we going to be able to pull in, and for PII privacy issues as well, like what is the data that we can and can't have in here. But then for whatever reason, after this, we finalized the DMP, and like the entire organization found out about it. It was, again, people were coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, we've got more data. We've got viewership here, and we've got CRM there, and we've got all this additional stuff that might be useful for you guys. So we basically just said, okay, well, thanks for showing up now. We'll put you at the end of the roadmap, and we're going to start with the obvious, simple stuff that we have, particularly first-party CRM data first, and then move from there.
So I think that, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to criticize you here, but it does sound like getting all these stakeholders on board before the choice is made. Well, it poses its problems too, because then you have 10 stakeholders in the room on the RFP decision, and that's its own problem. But at least the one thing it solves at the end is kind of that getting everybody in the room and getting everything together and finding, somebody might have something, new considerations that might have affected your choice ultimately. I doubt there's anything too crazy like that hiding within the business, but you never know. So I think there's kind of pros and cons to bringing all the business units together early and after the fact. But I'd hope is if you're dealing with an organization with lots of business units, you can kind of put that onus on them in the middle of the RFP, at the beginning of the RFP process.
Yeah, and I mean, essentially that's what we tried to do, right? I think it was just a matter of, when you get to certain organizations, they're so large, they literally don't even know their own breadth of what's available. And that's kind of the recent implementation that we did, is what we ran into, is essentially we didn't realize that some of that stuff was actually accessible. And that was more of what it was, right? It was less about understanding whether or not it existed. It was really understanding whether or not it was accessible for us. And originally we just thought no, mostly for privacy issues in this particular instance. But so yeah, it was, the really important thing for us though was we are the managers of this. So yes, while there are people we need your input from, like you said, like you can't have 10 chiefs in a room, right? We basically made ourselves the one chief, and then kind of used everybody as our Indians from there, I guess.
All right. And with the DMP in place now, so navigating the politics and everything, what are the initial priorities? Michael, you already mentioned frequency capping and kind of that is kind of the easy wins. But what are those kind of easy wins in that onboarding phase where, or the first 6 months, let's say?
So we've had some clients who just the mere fact of breaking down those data silos is a win. Obviously, they've maybe had years and years of making these silos, so just using a DMP to finally get to that single custom review was a win for them. And then from there, years later, they can then start doing things. But for others, yeah, frequency capping, there's then customer journey analytics, so kind of a attribution light, for example, finding out the paths that your users are taking to get to whatever you care about, whether it's a subscription or product purchase or whatever it might be. And then more advanced things like sequencing off and on site, and using the intelligence you gain from journeys to actually deliver more users down those optimal paths. Those are typically the steps that people take. But it all depends on what kind of legwork you've done during the RFP process and then after. We see a lot where people are well prepared. They've worked with folks like Morgan and others to prepare their teams, and then other folks where there's a big, I bought a DMP, now what moment. So there's different things, different plays that we can run to help get you there. But certainly there's a certain path to get you down to the ideal ultimate fantasy that we all care about is that completely automated, data-driven marketing, off and on-site. Everything's personalized, that's shown at the right time on the right site. Customers love it. They come to your site. They buy your product and service. Obviously, it's a multi-step process to get you there.
Morgan and Clayton, do you have anything to add on that? Just kind of, the first things you want to check off once you get.
Sure. So, I mean, the analytics wins that you mentioned are great. I think it's also dependent on what you're already doing and making that, amplifying that and making it better. So if you're already running, a lot of retargeting campaigns, it's about using the DMP to make those retargeting campaigns run better. Or if you're doing lookalike modeling, but maybe you didn't have access to kind of all of the breadth and depth of data that a DMP has, again, being smarter about how you're doing lookalike modeling and segmentation. So I think it's really dependent on the marketer and what they want to achieve.
Yeah, one of the things that we saw was the whole lookalike model was one of the first things that we wanted to figure out, mostly because, again, this most recent instance, the client didn't necessarily know what their perfect customer looked like, which is odd, right? You would think of, especially the amount of data that we have on these people. But it was interesting. I mean, it's 90% of your client base actually isn't that profitable for you, right? What does that 10% look like? Because that's where the power of the DMP is, right? And now you're talking about one-to-one targeting. I can probably still bring in those 90% with doing everything that I've been doing up to this point for the last 35 years, but that 10%, that needs to now become 20%, and I need to know exactly who that person is so I can hit the hell out of them over and over and over again. So I think that was probably one of our first steps was how do we use the DMP to help us figure out what that actually looks like, and we're still working through that, to be honest. I think, again, it comes back to a lot of different data sources, but that was one of the first things that we basically needed help on.
And then moving even further into the future, I guess, where are you already thinking about pushing, or where would you like to push the DMP partners to improve? Like, where are the gaps right now? And it might be a gap in technology, it might be just gaps in customer service, but where would you like to push them to improve? And it's an open question for anyone. And Mike, you can even say what you guys are working on, since I don't want,
I'll let them go first.
Sure. So, I mean, more and better integrations, I think, is a big one. Because so much of the way that the DMP works is dependent on the activation places that I can use the DMP. I think DMPs actually have to sort a lot of that out and make those relationships happen. And then, the technical side, create those integrations. The other thing would just be openness of data. I think most marketers don't know what to do with raw behavioral cookie level data, but there are some that do, and it's very difficult to get right now from a DMP. So would encourage DMPs to think about that and how to work with marketers that have big data environments and have analytic capabilities to build segmentation and modeling on their own. So that's another big one that we ask for and typically is very difficult to get.
Ditto.
For me, I think, again, to go back to the organizational piece, if you don't have the people ready from all the different teams ready for a DMP, it's going to be a tough road. We'll help get you there, but it's tough for everyone. So building that consensus, that data center of excellence, we call it again, cross-functional, getting all that stuff done early, hopefully, or quickly soon after you've decided on your DMP is key, getting the people involved.
All right, so with an eye towards the future as we round up here, data exchanging between brands and really across agency clients even. It doesn't seem like from my previous conversations that you guys think we're there yet or had specific kind of applications of it. What are there hurdles preventing this? Is there even really a desire for it right now? Are you guys hearing it? Is this kind of another way that brands could use their DMPs to monetize?
Yeah, I think it's a couple years coming now, but we're starting to see second-party data really become more critical to a marketer. Whether that second-party data comes from another marketer or from a publisher and media company, we're starting to finally see that data sharing, not necessarily within an agency, although that could happen, but also just amongst people from other agencies and everything. So that's starting to happen. I think first-party data is super important. Thank you for mentioning that. That's obviously the number one thing. I think for a while we've all been using third-party data to various degrees of success. I think people are finally realizing the power and potential of second-party data, and we're starting to see more of that. So it's really starting to start.
We're moving there, but it's still not even close to where it needs to be, right? And you talked about the internal agency thing. We've tried to push this model, but I think what we continue to run into is a lack of wanting to share data from the client. I mean, it's their data, it's their private. It's like, why would I, give your entire agency access to this when I don't know that 100% of your clients are going to buy in? And so I think there's some internal politicking that has to go on there as well. But so I think there's onus put on the agencies. I think like you were talking about from a publisher standpoint. I mean, some of these companies sit on just ridiculous amounts of data that again sits in their walled garden, and it's a pain in the ass. Right? It doesn't do anybody any good. It's not solving a problem. It's great for you, Facebook and AOL and Google. Not calling out names, but like it's they're probably not in the room, are they? That'd be great. But that's the problem, right? Is everybody, it feels like for us to get a real solution, everybody's going to have to play nice and share all this data together, and that's the only way you're going to find a universal solution to this whole thing. And who the hell is going to do that when they could be making money off that instead, right? Maybe the $6.5 billion or whatever that Google's worth or Facebook are all worth. Like, they don't need the money anyway. They should just be giving us this data, right? So I don't know if there's actually ever, if you're really going to see a solution, at least not in the near term. Maybe the government will make it mandatory or something. They start hacking our iPhones. So it feels like theoretical to me. I just don't see it ever being a truly like a universal data sharing where everybody now has access to everything. And it'd be great as a consumer, right? Because I know I'm getting the right advertising, but at the same time, I'd probably be freaked out by it. So.
I think if the question's about whether second-party data sharing is something that is going to be happening in the next couple of years, I think the answer is no. I think there's already tests and betas of companies in Europe and companies in China and companies here that are doing it. But the challenge from making it just a test and a little pocket of innovation to making it a big kind of large scale thing that all organizations can do is a couple things. One is the technology barrier. We haven't reached the saturation point where all marketers have DMPs that are readily available to share data segments. And then the second one is governance. So if I'm a marketer, how do I know who should get my segment and who shouldn't? And then am I reaching that consumer that I'm actually targeting and going after and wanting to spend money too much by sharing it out with other non-competitive advertisers? So I think there's a couple things that are preventing that from taking place.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. I think, Steve, do you want to open it to Q&A?
Yeah,
Do we have time?
we have questions.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm with PulsePoint. We represent about 2,500 publishers, and we are looking to onboard more and more PMP deals. And the brands want to have these PMP deals because of the benefits that conveys, but they also want to have predictability about how that deal is going to perform, and they want to buy with their first-party data. So the question is, how can we go ahead and, representing the publishers, provide that predictability about what a PMP deal is going to do using advertiser first-party data? How do we unlock that question, that equation?
I don't think it's easily predictable, just in the fact that I don't know how much of my first-party data is going to match to a publisher's data until I actually match it up and see what the audience segments are. So I think it's going to be difficult to actually forecast what the reach and performance of that audience segment is going to be. I think, though, that publishers need to get better at data sharing back to advertisers and real-time transactional data sharing, and not passing me an aggregated report. So any kind of strides that we can make in that area, I think, are good. But it's going to be hard for the publishers, I think, to forecast what a marketer's first-party segment is going to do on their property.
And I think we're starting to see more BYOD, bring your own data, for an advertiser. So bring in their data to a publisher's DMP. Obviously, that requires the publisher or their partner to have data DMP capabilities to take in this data and then pass it back into the ad server. We're starting to see more of that, but I think without those kind of integrations with the publisher DMP and then within the actual 2,000 plus publishers ad servers, you're going to lose not only the lack of user matching, but also the ability to get any predictability out of it.
It's worth a question too. I mean, are the advertisers that are winning this predictability, are they not giving you the data to be able to do predictive analysis on it?
Well, what they ask, they're worried about PII. They're worried about, they think that so I talk to agencies, and they're worried about their brand saying, oh, they'll never approve that. And they say, well, I don't see any other way of doing it, so go ahead and ask them. So we go ahead and come back a week or two later, and they say, they don't want to really do that, so we'll just run it, and it'll run as it runs. Well, great, then we can't go ahead and get to scale that you want to achieve on your particular ad buy. You have $50,000 that you need to go ahead and spend this month on this particular data segment, and you're not willing to share. For all we know, it's going to go ahead and do $6, or it could go ahead and be 40 million, who knows? And so they're just not willing to share, not willing to talk about it. They're not willing to sign papers. The whole BYOD thing, I guess I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, the advertisers shouldn't be sharing their PI with you. Ideally, they'll have a DMP, and that DMP should have already anonymized that data, so it becomes an anonymized syncing between their DMP and your DMP, you the publisher. So it should all be anonymized. So there might be some miscommunication as far as the feeling that they need to contribute PII into this BYOD is not necessarily the case. That would be my first response. Yeah.
I want to, Gary's going to come on in a second to talk specifically about data security and privacy and regulation, but I wanted to get the perspective, if you guys could address how your clients, what the state of that issue is among your clients. Privacy, security data, consumer sensitivities about it, and how it's addressed, if it's addressed at all, and also attitudes towards regulation.
From our perspective, all of our clients it's on top of all of their lists, right? I mean, specific brands have so much information about you that their legal departments are like the worst nightmare for a marketing department, right? So everything we do is encrypted, and it's all these crazy words that I don't understand, but it's required, right? And that's part of the other reason that how we sold in the DMP was for that purpose, right? Like you can anonymize this stuff so that it's actually useful now, as opposed to sitting in your data warehouse where only you can use it, right? And it becomes like a direct mail data warehouse. Great. If you want to be able to put this into the market from a digital perspective or programmatic TV or anything along those lines, right? It's got to be accessible. And so our legal teams probably earned their very large salaries when they work through that whole thing, because I think ultimately that's a really difficult situation. But the hardest part, I think, is how do you tell your consumer, right, your clients, that you've got their data now. And I think that's a very tricky situation, and I think there's a lot of brands that can get in trouble when they do that. You could do the Facebook way of just like changing the T's and C's and putting a link somewhere and saying, hey, just in case, The proper way to do it, right, is to educate them and to send them emails and call them and let them know that you're doing this stuff and that you're taking the proper steps to make sure that their information is protected and encrypted and it's not going to be accessible to whoever. So I think the brands themselves are going to have to figure that out as well, because there's a lot of concern around it, but it should be at the top. And from our agency only, right, that's my only perspective, is that every one of our brands, that is very much at the top of all their lists.
And I'd like to add to that. I think one thing I've found is it's really a knowledge gap, because we're trying to explain what's actually being shared and what's available with legal people who don't understand the intricacies of ad tech. So it's really, and they'll just say straight up, what variables are being passed? What are they seeing? Is it anonymized? Is it anonymized? Is it just a UID? Like, what are we actually saying? Because they get scared whenever you talk about, because they know they have PII data. They know it's super sensitive. They get scared whenever you even say, oh, we want to consolidate the data everywhere. They might not understand the complexities and kind of the steps already being taken. So it's really just having that initial education moment and making it as easy to understand as you can. We've done countless schematics and kind of PowerPoints showing what goes where when people land on what. And I actually find that helps a lot. And also just having that documentation whenever we have a new implementation, whether it's a DMP or any other data partner, it makes it go so much smoother. So that's one other thing I'd call out.
I wanted to follow up Clayton's point about the consumer interface and the decision to talk to the consumer. Among any of you, do you have any clients who are actually starting that conversation with consumers? Or are they, my sense is that brands are in the same position that many media publishers were in 4 or 5 years ago, where they have that direct interface with the consumer. Privacy is an issue that's directly between them. They don't even want to raise the issue, because just to raise it is almost to start a conversation that they don't feel ultimately they can win, or they can explain well. But it seems as if, certainly, discussion we're going to have tomorrow about ad blocking suggests consumers are getting increasingly sensitive to it, and the way they respond to it is going to impact how well brands can actually reach them in the future. So the question is, are any of your clients actually starting to have conversations directly with consumers about how they're managing their data, what they're doing with it, how they're sharing it?
Only to the minimum as required by law. I mean, let's be quite honest.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's been proactive in terms of doing more than that. I think they're current policies and T's and C's because they've had either, if they're a media company, they've had the user and they abide by those, or as a marketer, they bought something online or whatever, signed up for something. They've given the marketer or the media company the right to do some marketing and things like that. So I think they've done that in terms of communication, but nothing more than that as far as getting ahead of that and educating a little bit more. Obviously, they own that direct relationship. But yeah, I don't think anyone's stepped into that water yet.
Well, Apple just did. Whether they wanted to or not, right?
I think just in your personal life, I mean, I would expect my email inbox to be flooded by this kind of communication if brands were actually doing it, and I don't see any of that, right? I think every once in a while, again, from some of the social networks, you'll find out that they're stealing more about you or selling, you know, who you are, whatever it might be. But just from a personal standpoint, no, I don't think any of our brands are doing it, and I'll agree with everybody else that they're doing the minimal. But I don't think I've seen anybody do it really well, right? I know that Target and Amazon, all these people have a shit ton of data about me, but for whatever reason, I'm not seeing anything pop in my email or text message telling me that my terms and conditions have changed or they're doing anything with it. So I don't think there's any, I haven't seen any real life examples at all.
Right. Any other questions? Guy and panel, thank you very much. Let me ask Gary, all of this conversation now, all the headlines around Apple are in fact about this very conversation about how, not only how brands maintain their own data, but also the kinds of conversations that they have in public with their own consumers. We're actually seeing it play out now in the headlines because what Apple is doing in its conversation with the FBI and the federal government is really a conversation with their consumers about trying to make the argument, we have your back. And in all the years I've been covering privacy, it's always been one of the questions I've always had in the back of my mind. Why aren't brands and publishers getting ahead of the issue and talking directly to consumers and using it to their advantage to talk to consumers? Because I think when we had our showdown in DC in January about some of these very issues about trust, one of the things that the FTC made very clear to us on stage was regulations coming. And the ways in which publishers and brands get ahead of the issue now will determine to some degree how much the FTC regulates. To talk about some of these key issues and offer some best practices for how brands manage their data, we have Gary Keibel, who is a partner of Digital Media and Technology and Privacy Practice Group at Davis & Gilbert. He advises many companies throughout this value chain that we're talking about here about these very issues. Please welcome Gary Keibel.
All right, thanks very much, Steve. And thanks for the great lead-in from the last panel that legal is your worst nightmare. So your nightmares come to life. We're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk first about what is programmatic law? Because I get that question a lot from folks. You know, what law applies to the programmatic space? And it's a patchwork of different issues. We see in the slide here. A lot of it's really contractual. The contracts you enter into in this space. Then there are self-regulatory principles we have to be aware of. And as Steve mentioned, the Federal Trade Commission is very involved in this. And then there's old legislation that impacts your industry, and there's new legislation which could come down the pipe and really change things significantly. Let's see if this video works for a little fun here. You got sound? And it's very choppy.
The numbers, they keep getting bigger and bigger. Clicks are off the chart.
All right, we're going to skip that because it's a little bit choppy. Google it. It's an Adobe commercial. Basically, the theme of the day, that data is gold. It's a great spot about data being gold. So when we deal with data in the programmatic space, I've been involved in the digital media space for about 16 years. So sort of back in the Stone Age. And it was very different when we spoke about data back in the traditional display world. Back then, we had very basic information. We had the I/O details and the insertion order and some performance data and maybe some user volunteer data if a user filled out a form. It was very basic stuff. Now in the programmatic space, we have much more sophisticated data. The bid data, both the winning data and the losing bid data. I've dealt with parties, DSPs, that get very concerned about people fishing for losing bid data because you can gain tremendous knowledge on the bids you don't win. There's data you get from a platform, from a third-party DMP. Different tagging you do on your own site. And then, of course, there is the data that's generated through the actual campaigns. So there's data coming from lots of different sources. And whenever you're dealing with privacy issues in this space, you want to think about what is the source of the data? What permissions are attached to that data? What disclosures were made to the consumer when that data was collected? And sometimes it's hard to match that up because somebody may say, I have a great data segment for you, but you should ask the questions about where did it come from? How was it generated? And what disclosures were made at that time? Other issues about, where is the data collected? And, this is a sophisticated audience. Sometimes I speak to audiences that don't understand where and how it can be collected, but through the different tagging and pixels that you're using to collect the data. It's very important when you work with parties to ask detailed questions about, it's not enough to know that someone's placing a pixel on your site or they're putting a tag on an ad. You need to know, what is that pixel or tag doing? What is it collecting? What type of data? And who's it going to transmit it to? You've probably all used Ghostery's app and taken a look at someone's site and see what tags are there. And I've been in the room with marketers when someone has brought up the Ghostery app and showed them all the tags on their site. And you've never seen legal jump out of their chair, as fast as can be, when all these company names show up, which you and I know are probably very legitimate companies, but they've never heard of them. And they just flip out that these companies are living on the homepage of their corporate site. So you want to be very involved with clients, and if you're buying or selling in this space, to have full disclosure about what's being collected. And then in the way you use the data for targeting, there's a big difference between actual segments and targeting individuals versus lookalike models. Because legally, when we're looking at maybe a lookalike model, then we could argue, well, we're not using your data for tagging, for targeting. We're using your data for analytics. And there may be different rights that associate with that data. So lookalike modeling can be very different. And deterministic or probabilistic modeling, again, it might make a big difference with the privacy disclosures that have been made to a consumer, depending upon whether you are using their actual data to actually target them, or you're using their data to just learn information. I've dealt with clients that have done a campaign where they've taken the data, used it for a lookalike model, and then made sure that the users that helped generate that lookalike model were excluded from the ultimate targeting. That way they could say they never used any of those individuals' data for individual targeting. What's next? I mean, obviously there are lots of different tracking methods. I think what's important on the slide there is that the Federal Trade Commission is coming around. They are learning. I think years ago they really did not understand this space very much, but they are really starting to learn. And this was a quote from a very senior person at the FTC saying that we are so beyond cookies at this point. And that was, to me, a striking statement from a lawyer at the FTC, that they really understand that the data is coming from so many different sources, and they're going to look at all those different sources. Last on legal issues before we jump a little bit more into data. When you're doing contracts in this space, obviously there's a lot of issues. The finances are very important. And when you deal with contracts in this space, there's a lot of things to deal with in terms of who's doing the monitoring for compliance. What is the timing for disputes about payment issues? And the reason is that things move so quickly in this industry. So if somebody does an audit and 90 days later realizes there's a problem and raises a complaint about why money was paid for a particular campaign, it may be too late. So you want to think about timing for payments. And then transparency issues, whether or not you're going to be completely transparent about your costs and your fees and your inventory, or if you're going to do, as one person said, be transparent about not being transparent. But obviously there's a big push with the 4As and the ANA, with the trade associations, about transparency. The 4As has put forth the transparency guidelines about being transparent with clients. So you want to think about these issues in this space. So self-regulatory compliance, you've probably seen these letters thrown around a lot, DAA, NAI, and everyone says, yeah, we're compliant. They are two very different organizations, and it's important that you understand how they are different. The Digital Advertising Alliance was created at the behest of the FTC because back in 2007, 2009, the FTC was starting to go to Capitol Hill and push for legislation for behavioral marketing. So all the trade associations got together and developed the DAA to have a set of self-regulatory principles that everybody would comply with. The DAA's view of the world is that if you are in the behavioral retargeting data space, you must comply with these principles. It doesn't matter whether you've joined, it doesn't matter if you're an agency, an ad tech company, or a marketer or a publisher. Their view is that you must comply with these principles. And if you don't, they have an enforcement mechanism, which doesn't have the power of law. It's mostly a name and shame approach, but they have an enforcement mechanism. That's very different than the NAI. The NAI is a membership-only organization. If you don't belong to the NAI, then it does not apply to you, and they will not come after you. And members of the NAI tend to be networks. So it's very different, whereas no matter who you are in this space, the DAA could come knocking at your door. Not so true with the NAI. But the NAI is a higher standard of privacy, and if you're looking for sort of a nice seal of approval of your practices, then joining the NAI can have great benefits. And then there are international versions of all of these. Where do the contracts come from? The contracts are everywhere. There are platform agreements on insertion orders. You have click-through terms. I'm sure all of you have clicked through endless terms all the time, binding your companies to actual contracts. You have to realize that when you're an individual and say you're buying something online and you click, yes, I agree, there are courts that might not enforce those contracts. But if you're sitting in your office on behalf of your company and you click, yes, I agree, virtually every court in the US will enforce those contracts. So they are binding. So sorry, you have to talk to those people at legal once in a while. All right, let's talk more about big data. The term is thrown around a lot, and people don't know what it means. Does it apply to this programmatic industry? Is that really, the axioms of the world and people with personal information? Well, it's sort of a little of everything. So big data, I had to pull a definition from Wikipedia, because where else do you go for the truth? It says big data is a blanket term from any collection of data set so large and complex that it becomes difficult to process using on-hand database management tools. And then they had a definition for information broker. As you'll see in some of the issues I'm going to talk about in a moment, definitions are incredibly important in the legal world when it comes to laws. Because if someone said, we're going to regulate data brokers, most of you in the room might say, well, I'm not a data broker. And some of you may say, I don't know what a data broker is in this context. It's the definitions that make a difference. Because under some bills that have been proposed, you are data brokers. And these laws would regulate your business practices. And in others, they may not. So what is personal information? Again, we hear oftentimes people saying, well, this product doesn't deal in personal information. It's only non-personal information, non-PI. And that's supposed to make everybody comfortable. But what's the definition? Well, there is no one definition in the United States. There are different laws that have different definitions. COPPA with children, HIPAA for healthcare, GLB for financial services, and there are different state security breach notification laws. They all define it differently. There's not one definition of PII. In the EU, it's very different and very broad and very scary. In the EU, they define personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. So you have an actual definition. It's unbelievably broad. And for those of you who have dealt with business in the EU, a persistent identifier like a cookie or an IP address can be personal data, according to the EU. Same is becoming true in Canada. But in the US, again, we don't have one definition. But we're starting to move in a direction, and the Federal Trade Commission wants to move into your industry. They want what you think as non-PII to be considered PII. And here's how they're doing it. COPPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It was passed back in the early 2000s. Very simply said that you can't collect personal information from a child online if they're under 13 without their child's consent, without the parent's consent. So that was very basic, and they defined it as name, address, telephone number, all those basic pieces of information. Well, in 2013, the Federal Trade Commission expanded the definition of personal information to include persistent identifiers. What's a persistent identifier? A cookie. And so what happened as a result of this change is that the behavioral advertising world realized we can't target children online anymore. Now, there's a knowledge element to this law, so if you don't know, then you may not be liable. But if you're on a site with that deals with car rentals, you can be comfortable that there aren't children on their site. But if it's a site with fluffy purple dinosaurs, you have to suspect there might be children there. So persistent identifiers, the FTC views those as personal information, and they managed to get it into law here. They would like to get into law everywhere, but it's not. But they've done it through consent orders, as I'll show in a moment. It happens in litigation too. Again, trying to define what information is personal information. There's a law from back in the 1980s called the Video Privacy Protection Act. There's been a lot of talk in the Supreme Court lately, so a little history. For those of you who remember, back in the 1980s, President Reagan nominated Justice Bork to the Supreme Court. And there were a lot of liberals and people on the left who didn't like him, and especially his approach to privacy. He said that there's no right to privacy in the Constitution. So an intrepid reporter in Washington, D.C. got access to his videotape rental records from a store in Washington, D.C. So everyone could see what tapes he had rented. And for those of you who might be a little bit young in the audience, videotapes were these little black boxes. You can imagine that it was upsetting to Justice Bork about this information being public, but who was it more upsetting to? The people in Congress who realized, wow, my videotape rental history could be exposed to the whole world. Now, Justice Bork rented very boring movies, but you can imagine what the congressmen were renting. So they very quickly, and in a bipartisan way, passed this law which said, personally identifiable information includes information which identifies a person as having requested or obtained specific video materials or services from a videotape service provider. Sorry, lawyers and weasel words. There's a lot of definitions, all throughout there. What is personally identifiable information? Who is a videotape service provider? Believe it or not, Netflix and Hulu were viewed by the courts as being videotape service providers. Yes. And so there was a lawsuit about, using the Facebook like button to collect information that would then be transmitted over to Facebook. Now, a lot of detail here, and it's ultimately settled, but it came down to how it's defined. The learning is that there are old laws on the books that apply to this industry. And so when you talk to your legal counsel, you have to recognize that they need to go back and look at all this old stuff, because what you're doing could pull up laws from the 1980s that impact what we're doing today. Data matching, this is obviously a big issue. Whenever dealing with a project, and these projects are fantastic and they are very effective, you need to go back and look at the privacy policy and talk about, the privacy policy talks about how you're going to use the data. Very simply, if a privacy policy said, we'll never share your data with a third party, well, if you now take the data and give it to a third party matching company to do a match, that's technically giving the data to a third party. A properly drafted privacy policy might talk about uses and have carve-outs for certain sharing. So whenever you're involved in a project, you need to go back and look at the privacy policy that was presented to the consumer when the data was collected. And then you can analyze, is this project permitted under the policy? Many times it will be, but you need to go ahead and check. And if it's not, then you need to talk with someone about modifying their privacy policy so that you can do those projects in the future. This is what the FTC is scared about. This may seem completely unrealistic, but this is really what they're terrified about. This is an actual mailer that was received by an individual. It says, Mike Say, daughter killed in car crash or current business. That was an actual mailer that somebody got. And this is what the FTC is concerned about. They're concerned that you're collecting so much data and you're not controlling how it's going to be used, that's going to be used in bad ways. Now, we can all read between the lines here. What probably happened is there might have been a data broker, and that had a field about death in the family. And they may have had a field for a very legitimate purpose. Maybe they did not want to send offers to that person for certain things. It was going to be used for suppression. But in whatever the campaign was, there was a mix-up, and it ended up being printed on the envelope. But that's what the FTC is concerned about, that you're going to inadvertently or intentionally use data for very bad purposes. This happened to me as well. I got this mailer at home, and it was addressed to my son, Spencer, and it was for wine. And my son does not drink wine. And at the time he received that, he was 6 months old. So obviously somebody purchased a very bad list. So reports. I mentioned there are old laws in this space. I'll talk about some new laws that are being proposed. But as I said, there's not a lot of laws right on target. So what's happening is all these different agencies and government entities are coming out with reports telling you their view of how big data is good, bad controls that should be put in place. So it's important to understand their thinking. So it goes back a couple of years ago. The FTC's put out lots of statements. Don't need to read every one there. But the big thing is in red there, what the FTC commissioner said. She said that there's a real risk of lack of transparency and loss of consumer control. And I think that's the big key. They're not saying you can't use data for these purposes. They're okay using data for these purposes. They're just concerned about transparency and control for the consumer, a way for the consumer to get out of it, and a way that the consumer can understand what you're doing. There's been lots of reports and statements put out, and there's issues of lack of transparency and access to data. Those themes keep coming up. Even the White House got involved in the big data debate. President Obama's administration put out a report on big data, and as you can tell from the photo, he thought really long and hard about these big data issues. One interesting thing they came up with, which both the FTC and the administration has latched onto, is discriminatory outcomes of data, and really unintended discriminatory outcomes of data. It is quite likely that the data that's used in the programmatic space may have a discriminatory effect on different socioeconomic groups or protected classes. And I think we would all agree in this room, it's not intentional. No one's trying to exclude it, but the data, some would argue that data is inherently biased. And so other people. And granted, there's no per se violation of law yet, but it's very important to think that the regulators are thinking about this. They're very concerned about the impact this has on different groups. Why, certain people of a certain social background or economic background are not going to get the same offers as others. And it's because this industry is crunching the data and cranking out the offers without any intention of harming a different group. But they're starting to think about how they can deal with that legally in upcoming laws. So the FTC put out two major reports on data brokers. First one in 2014, and they had to define data brokers. Again, who's a data broker? Who are we talking about? And they said companies that collect consumers' personal information and resellers share that information with others. That kind of sounds like every company in the United States, pretty much. And again, what is personal information in this context? But again, they were concerned about the lack of transparency and that consumers are unaware of what's being done with this information, and that it's virtually impossible for consumers to really opt out, which is sort of the truth, as we know. I mean, we have the little ad choices icon that is served billions upon billions of times every day on the ad. And the industry likes to brag how many times the icon's been served, but the number of times that people actually opt out is ridiculously minuscule. And that's why some have been pushing for a complete DNT, do not track option, so that consumers can just press that big red button and opt out of all tracking. But you want to think about giving consumers control, giving them some ability, if they're really concerned about privacy, to do something about it. Think about if you had to step back for a second, if you were your mother using this service. Maybe that's a bad example. My mom has a flip phone. She can't figure out anything. But if it was someone not in this industry and they were looking at something, they were a little bit creeped out, and they said, I want to find out more information, or I want to get out of this thing, there's got to be some way for them to do it. The honest truth is we may not make it the easiest thing in the world for them because we don't want to lose every consumer, but there has to be some way for them to get out of the tracking or to find out more about what you're doing. The most recent report came out in 2016, and it actually focused on the issue I just mentioned before about discriminatory outcomes of data. They were focusing on what laws really exist, because I said in the big data space, there are not many laws out there. So they focus on a few: the FTC Act, which we'll talk about in a moment, Fair Credit Reporting Act, which deals with giving people offers for credit and for employment and for other purposes, and equal opportunity laws, and talked about how the big data industry is misusing data in violation of these laws. I think there were two interesting things that came out of this report. It was telling that they could really only cite 3 laws that really apply to the big data industry today. And secondly, I like the dissent from Commissioner Olhausen, who did not like the tone of the report. And she said, if we give undue credence to hypothetical harms, we risk distracting ourselves from genuine harms and discouraging the development of the very tools that promise new benefits to low-income, disadvantaged, and vulnerable individuals. She was basically saying, using data is good. There are very good outcomes for using data. And you've all heard that, like, Google can predict an outbreak of the flu faster than the CDC. And it's true, there are fantastic uses of data. So I think it's important for the industry always to promote the benefits of using data. It's not just for the creepy purposes. Last few sets of slides on what the FTC is doing today. So I talked about what laws are out there. This is really the big one. This one sentence governs the entirety of the advertising industry, privacy, data, really everything we do. It says, unfair methods of competition in or affecting commerce and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce are hereby declared unlawful. That's the key part of the FTC Act. That has been around for decades and decades and decades. That was used in the 1960s to go after people for deceptive television commercials about how shaving cream works. This is the sentence that's used when there's a data breach and data is exposed. The FTC will say that that's an unfair act to collect someone's data and not keep it secure. This is what they do when you violate your privacy policy. They will say violating your privacy policy is deception. You told someone you're going to use data in one way, and then you use it in a different way. That's deception. And so really, this is their main hammer they have right now. I talked about children's issues before and some health and finance, but this is the one sentence they use to go after this industry. So what have they done? Trying to find ways to use that sentence to go after this industry. They went after the practice of flash cookies because they viewed a deceptive statement in a privacy policy. If the privacy policy says you can opt out of receiving a cookie by changing your browser settings to prevent the receipt of cookies. Very standard sentence. Well, if it's a flash cookie, as we know, you can't opt out. So change your settings all you want. It's going to respawn itself over and over again. And so that's where they get you. They say, aha, that statement is deceptive, and now you violated the law. Another one dealing with history sniffing. And again, it was the statement that was in the privacy policy. The statement in the privacy policy said that we're just going to collect information about consumers' visits to sites in our network. But they were doing history sniffing and collecting information about visits outside the network. Again, it was deceptive. The statement in the privacy policy was wrong. This one, not a privacy one, but very important. I'll throw it up here. Sometimes you might think, well, I didn't do something wrong. It was my vendor. And that's probably the worst thing you could ever say to the FTC if they came knocking on your door. They believe that you are responsible for monitoring and controlling your vendors and subcontractors. And that if your vendor has done something wrong, it's probably because you didn't monitor them closely enough. So vendor liability is a big issue. It's the worst thing you can do to sit across from the FTC attorneys and say, my vendor did it. They'll say, you've basically just admitted that you've done something wrong because it's your job to watch out for them. One of the most recent ones dealt with in-store beacons, and this was a really controversial one. So, as many of you know, you walk into a Target or Walmart or anywhere, and sorry for naming names, but they are tracking what you're doing, where you're walking throughout the store by pinging your smartphone, because your smartphone is always looking for Wi-Fi hotspots and looking for Bluetooth devices and sending out a signal so they can track where you are. Usually the tracking they're doing in the store is very basic stuff. They want to know when people walk in the store, how many walk down aisle 2 versus aisle 7, so we can figure out how better to lay out our stores. So there was a company that helped do this very basic information, nothing scary. But they decided to go above and beyond. And they said in their privacy policy that you can always opt out of our tracking on our website as well as at any retailer. Well, the truth is at the retailers there were no signs. There was no way to opt out. It was impossible. And on their website, there was a way to opt out, but you didn't know that they were tracking. You didn't know who they were, so why would you ever go to their website and opt out? And the FTC brought enforcement action against them. It upset a lot of people in the privacy world because a lot of us felt they didn't have to say anything. The data they were collecting was so basic. Again, who walks down aisle 2? Why does a consumer need the right to opt out from that? There are CCTV cameras that can collect that already. But they decided to be good guys and say something in their privacy policy. But they said it wrong. So the important thing is if you're going to say something, say it right. And don't try to be the greatest guy in the world by giving consumers the greatest rights they've ever seen if you haven't thought about how it's going to be implemented. 2 last slides, and then we'll be done, maybe do Q&A before, or go right into the roundtables. This is not so much of a privacy-specific thing, but mergers and acquisitions. M&A is a very big part of this industry. And when you merge or you acquire another company, you inherit their privacy commitments. You inherit their disclosures to consumers when you buy their data. So their data has certain rights and privileges and maybe restrictions that comes along with it. And the FTC is starting to look at that now and put out this statement last year that said one company's purchase of another doesn't nullify the privacy promises made when the data was first collected. So they are specifically looking for this right now in M&A transactions. And they've sent letters when they've heard about different deals to both companies on both sides, the buyer and seller, reminding them of their obligations with respect to privacy. Legislation, I'll probably just skip through that. Sorry, I'm doing my George Bush here. But there's been a lot of things. I mean, the California Online Privacy Protection Act requires disclosure about how you respond to do not track signals. And then my next few slides are all these proposed laws, which have all died in committee or been vetoed, but once they come into play, they're going to be scary. California had one that required online data brokers to notify consumers when you would transfer their personal information, and they defined personal information incredibly broadly. So, again, think the DMP world. You're going to share data with somebody, you got to tell the consumer, and be a radical change to the business model. Thank goodness it died. Illinois came up with one in their security breach notification law. You get those letters at home if your social security number is exposed or your credit card. They wanted to add consumer marketing information. So now if your cookies were exposed, you'd have to go and tell somebody that that happened. That one was vetoed by the governor, thank goodness. One was proposed in Congress, but proposed by Democrats, so that's going nowhere. One was proposed, another one in the House, again, it's probably going to go nowhere, majority's control, about the Apps Act, about how data is collected through mobile apps. And again, it's all about giving consumers control and notice and disclosures. The very last thing I'll say is I think a good rule of thumb with all of this is don't be creepy. This is an example of what happened to me. I went to one of those trendy, hip burger places where I live in Westchester County in New York. And I'd never been there before, and I bought a burger, and it was great. And then at home in the mail, about 3 months later, I got this coupon in an envelope. And I opened it up, and I'm thinking, how in the world did these people know it was my birthday? Because it came in the month of my birth. I never signed up for anything. They didn't know anything about me. And then I realized the way I paid for the burger. How did I pay for my burger? My credit card. I swiped my credit card. And they went and matched the data with someone to figure out, hopefully just the month of my birth. They certainly got my home address and sent it. And as a lawyer who deals with privacy issues, I was a little bothered. I didn't sign up for anything. I didn't consent to this. I didn't get disclosures. I went back and got my burger, of course. I'm not stupid. But that's the creepy element. And if you just thought there could have been some little disclosure they could have made, we'll send you a coupon, the month of your birth, simple things. With that, I'll turn it to Steve for either questions or right to roundtable.
Do we have, anybody have any questions? Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Itai from Warner. Actually, the last one was very interesting. About considering you do data matching, you have to segment. Let's say I have birthdays for my consumers that I collected, and they know I collected it, so I can send them a birthday campaign. It's a great engagement point. But then I do data matching and get birthdays for a lot of other people. They are in my system, and I have to kind of like segment not to send it to them because that'll be creepy, right? So how do you segment when you do the data match data you collected personally versus whatever? At the end of the day, the birthdays will be one column, so you got to know how you got it, which is, I think, an interesting point. But what I wanted to ask is about the point you made about the value. So we put these ad choices, and people think, oh my God, they're going to knock on my door, or they're going to see my credit card or information. And really, as an industry, we have to provide or show them the value of what this tracking is going to give them. Because if you think in 10 years from now in a personalized world, if you opt out, your experience could be very bad. Suddenly everything is personalized, but you're not. You have everything untargeted and unpersonalized in your world. Your internet experience, probably living experience, is going to be pretty bad. So how do we, convey the value so people won't opt out? And can we as an industry, not just legal, but as an industry, weed out the bad companies that misuse data or misuse targeting so that doesn't happen? Along with how do we best convey value in this type of atmosphere, in this kind of like environment?
This is a policy battle that's going on. On the one side, privacy advocates saying that consumers should be able to opt out of everything very easily. And on the other side, business community saying, look, content is supported by advertising, and we need to collect data and monetize data and serve ads in order to give free content. And so that's why I say it's about finding the balance and giving people disclosures. The scary thing for this industry, is if a bad law slips through. I don't think that will happen on the federal level because it would get a lot of attention, a lot of press, and not much gets passed in Congress. I mean, that's just the truth. The real fear, I think, for this industry is that some state passes a law which is incredibly restrictive on this industry. Now suddenly everyone's got to comply with the Minnesota statute on whatever that makes targeting very difficult. And I think that's the big fear for the industry.
Is that ultimately what's going to lead a lot of associations in the industry to press for national regulation because it helps resolve local eccentricities?
I think so. I think so. I mean, whenever you get federal legislation, it tends to be a lower standard. And so I think if you saw states doing some scary bills, and there's been some scary ones proposed in California which haven't passed, but I think that pushes everyone to want federal legislation that sets a nice low bar that everyone can meet.
Does that, the FTC clause that you showed a few slides ago about deception, is that going to be applied to native advertising?
Yes, that's been applied to native advertising since a policy statement the FTC put out in 1968 when native advertising has been around for decades. It's rebranded, but it's been around forever. And it's the exact same thing. It's a deception claim. It's that you tricked someone into viewing an ad.
Who tricked? The publisher, ad network, or a brand?
I think the FTC would say it is whoever's involved in it. The publisher tends to have more control over that, but it's really whoever's involved in the activity. They could go after an agency for buying it or an advertiser for approving it.
Native is a conspiracy. No, I mean, ultimately, Gary Keibel, thanks very much. That was great. And Gary's continue this in